Everyone, welcome to ACMT Grand Rounds. It's August 10th at noon. And this month we have Dr. Harry Chen, who's going to be presenting to us. It's very difficult to introduce Dr. Chen, so I'm going to largely let him introduce himself. He's had such a diverse background, and we're really excited to hear about some of the experiences he's had over the years. So Dr. Chen, I'm just going to turn it over to you.
Great, thanks, Nick. And at the outset, I actually just want to put a plug in and really my gratitude to all of those on the phone that were on the front line. Certainly, it's not over yet, but you definitely did make a difference. I also want to thank Paul and ACMT for all of the seminars. They put on webinars early on in the pandemic that I found, actually that's how I connected with ACMT and eventually with Paul. That really filled a void, I think, for the knowledge base that we so desperately needed early on in the pandemic. So I'm going to go ahead. I want to, and just kind of share with you a little bit of both my journey, but also the insights I've gleaned over the years. And this was actually one of my greatest adventures. It was a 12-day self-guided rafting trip in Alaska with my best friend for residency, with my EM residencies. Someday I'll do another talk on just that. So a little bit about myself. I was the first ER I worked in was in 1980 after my internship, and I got hooked on emergency medicine, and eventually went and did my residency at Oregon Health Science University, and was an AR physician for 30 plus years. And I recently connected with Paul when I was a senior advisor for the CDC Foundation in Region 3. I'm actually, for full disclosure, no longer doing that as that contract has ended, but certainly tried to participate as much as I could also in that pandemic response. I think obviously all of you know that emergency medicine is a team sport. This was my first real job in emergency medicine at GW. I don't know if you people recognize there's Ron Walls in the picture with his kid and me with my kids. So that was my foray into academic medicine. At the George Washington University Hospital, I also had a brief stint as the director of the hyperbaric unit at GW, which had a monoclase chamber at that time, and certainly learned a little bit about some of the capacities of hyperbaric oxygen, and I'm sure it's progressed a great deal since I was at the helm and practicing that way. George Washington, I was there for about 5 years, and what I found was a couple things. As my wife and I were having children, it was really a kind of a choice we had to make about, was Washington, D.C. where we wanted to settle down and raise a family. I'll be frank, was academic medicine and research and writing what I wanted to do myself. And I think I came up with an answer, which was no. And it was time to move on. And I happened to move on to Vermont, where I practiced for 28 years in emergency departments at various places in Vermont, including the University of Vermont, but primarily in the Rutland region, near, if you're a skier, near Killington, Vermont. The beauty of Vermont is that it's small and it's easily, you can really get your arms around it. And it really was a joy both for my family growing up, my kids, my wife, and myself. And one of the, in Vermont, if you don't like what's going on in the school, you join the school board. And if you don't like what's going on in the state legislature, you run for the legislature. So one of the things I did probably in the middle of my or toward the end of my emergency medicine career was to run for the legislature. Now, Vermont has a very large legislature, and you can see the 4 towns I represented on the bottom. It's roughly 4,000 people, so it's a really small group of people that you represent. when you run for election, you literally go door to door and knock on everyone's door. Yeah, and share with them your thoughts, your brochure, and hopefully that they'll vote for you. And I've often said that practicing emergency medicine in that area was helpful because those that they gladly, or most of them gladly, trusted me with their life. And I think the reality is they trusted me with their votes. So I became a legislator. In Vermont, the legislature is part-time. So I could tell my colleagues the good and the bad news. The bad news was that I was running for the legislature. The good news was that I would work every weekend. So I could be in the legislature Tuesday through Friday during the session. And that was really an extraordinary experience, both the campaigning and the serving in the legislature. I met lifelong friends in the legislature, developed relationships that to this day serve me very well in Vermont in any effort I'm trying to, anything in terms of policy. The reality was the legislature was at times a bit frustrating. I enjoyed the politics. I enjoyed the interaction with the people, listening to them. This is a ribbon cutting ceremony at the school. I was also in the school board of it that my kids went to school in. And this is all very helpful in terms of learning the skills and building those relationships. I did find that to some degree it was frustrating because the pace is, I'll call it glacial in terms of how legislature is made and how laws are enacted. So while I enjoyed it, I certainly was an extraordinary experience, gave me invaluable lessons. I got a bit frustrated. I think finally the kind of the straw that broke the camel's back was the governor vetoed some of my best work. So it was in itself somewhat frustrating. I did have the opportunity to testify on health reform and efforts in Vermont in Washington. This was one of my great experiences, to be at a roundtable with the health committee, rather than a hearing where they're sitting up there and you're sitting down below. This is you're all sitting around on a round table. One thing you don't see is you don't see my left hand here. I think for those of you that can appreciate it, I had just before I testified, I broke my wrist snowboarding, so I didn't show my cast in this picture. So then after a short hiatus, I had really the opportunity to shift my focus into public health and to join the public health team. And I think that's where I'm going to turn to next. And I think another thing about life is that I would say that serendipity has certainly played a significant role in my path. And I would certainly encourage everybody to consider that as a kind of a powerful force in terms of how it drives decisions that you make. And I'm going to give you an example here. This you can see me here with the governor. So this is Governor Peter Shumlin. He and I were in the legislature together. So, that's a relationship that became important. He and I actually disagreed a lot in the legislature. He was, I'll call him a libertarian, socially liberal libertarian, and he and I kind of did not come down on the same side of things very often. And so when he ran for election, I actually supported his opponent in the primary. But after he got the nod as the candidate, I helped him just because it was the right thing to do and to get somebody elected. And I'd say that I did mention to him somewhere along the line that I was interested in helping out some. I never dreamed of what would happen next. Is after he got elected, he called me in his office with a couple other folks of his advisors, and he asked me to be the health commissioner. And I had to say that when he said that, I was shocked. I was not expecting it. I was not looking for it. And I'll call that a little serendipity. I said, well, how long do I have to decide? And he said, you have 48 hours. So in that 48 hours, I had to make a decision do the proverbial hanging up of your stethoscope. And after talking to some advisors, talking to some former health commissioners, it actually became an easy choice, and certainly a choice that I didn't regret. And that was to join his administration as his health commissioner. And you know, as I alluded to, that there's some of the skills and experience I had along the way, whether it be interacting with constituents, whether it be interacting with legislators, whether it be building relationships in terms of the healthcare system, all of those things really helped me an incredible amount in terms of the right experience to be the health commissioner in Vermont. And one of the things that I became to appreciate, and certainly just like emergency medicine is a team sport, public health is a team sport. And what I came to appreciate was the importance of both motivating, guiding, supporting, and being positive around your team. And all of a sudden, from being an emergency physician or legislature, I had a team of about 600 people that were really depended on me for that leadership. And I grew to appreciate that tremendously. I felt like I did a great job of kind of motivating them. And to some extent, that was the thing I discovered, that I enjoyed it. I enjoyed leading a group of passionate, smart individuals, supporting them, and providing them the guidance they needed to get the job done. And this is one of the accomplishments, was when we were one of the first states in the union to get accredited as a health department. So accreditation, just much as you accredit a hospital, is something new in health departments to ensure that you have both the accountability, but also the efficiencies of the systems to provide appropriate guidance to the public. Lots of issues related to some of the controversies of the day. This was about vaccinations. Vermont happens to have some of the highest rates of kind of what we'll call the philosophical exemptions. And we were having trouble with pertussis outbreaks. And yes, we could try to control it, but really the vaccinations was the key. And we tried twice. I tried twice to repeal the exemption. The first time, actually, the governor and I did not share that the same sentiment. And one of the nice things about Governor Shumlin was that he allowed me to have some diversity of opinion, to state the science, to state my own opinion, understanding that he was ultimately the one that made the decision. But the second time around, he was supportive of the effort to repeal what we'll call the philosophical exemption. And I think one of the lessons I learned from that is the first time around, we were way too scientific. And we were just up in the clouds in terms of what normal people could understand. And I think in the second time around, we really came down, we got people to tell their personal stories, individuals with immunosuppression, kids who were immunosuppressed, who were afraid to send their kids to school. So I try to bring it down to a personal, kind of practical level, just such as the quote here, that vaccination is the safest thing you can do for your children, and trying to stay away from the science that oftentimes alienates the general public. Got lots of opportunities to be on media. I think that was really an important thing to do, because I needed to be out there. I needed to be vocal, measured, show common sense, and so one needed the Vermonters would listen to me, and I felt like I succeeded in that. To this day, I walk into the grocery stores and people still think I'm the health commissioner, even though thankfully I'm not during COVID. Another of the accomplishments that I look to with pride is when I was commissioner, we actually had the oldest public health lab in the nation. It was held together with duct tape and super glue, and I finally got a new one built. And This is the story which I think kind of tells you some of the, well, it really points to the importance of relationships. The state, when it builds a building, has a capital budget. And we were approved to build the building. And the first pot of money was to come out of 1 year's budget, and then the second pot would come out of the second year's budget. And the commissioner of buildings and grounds, the commissioner who does all the building, came to me and said, Harry, we have a problem. We need to use your money from the first year, but we'll make you whole in the second year. And certainly you could be suspicious about, was it a money grab, or were you not going to be able to build this public health lab? But I knew him. I knew him well from the legislature. And I think one of the things you do is you build trust. And I trusted this commissioner. And sure enough, he came through. And so this is the groundbreaking for the public health lab. And this is the lab. And the lab, when it was finally built, I think it was about $35 million. It was next to the old IBM plant, the most sophisticated building in Vermont. And so we went from the oldest lab to state-of-the-art new lab during, probably it was about 2016. And needless to say that this new lab came in very handy during the pandemic in terms of testing for coronavirus. This is a New York Times article by Kate Seeley, and it was a bit of a shock when the Governor Shumlin, devoted his whole State of the State speech to drug abuse in the opioid epidemic, to the extent that there was actually some fallout that maybe people weren't going to come to Vermont because of all the opioid related problems. But this was something that he was passionate about, something he understood from his conversations with Vermonters, that just much as with many places in the country, rural America, I think, was hit in this most recent opioid epidemic. And so he devoted his whole State of the State speech. He didn't talk about the budget. He didn't talk about jobs. He didn't talk about lowering taxes, any of that. All I talked about was the opioid epidemic. And I was up in the balcony, and I was texting back and forth as he was giving his speech with the author of this article, just to make sure she had her numbers right in terms of that. So as you might imagine, this was where a great deal of my focus was during my time as commissioner. These are mayors from two of the largest cities. All of the cities were experiencing the scourge of the opioid epidemic. The approach, I think, is a pretty accepted one that we took, which was a very comprehensive public health effort, starting with prevention, going all the way to harm reduction with trying to get out naloxone to everyone. Even though I certainly think that we were making some progress until the pandemic, but obviously we took a pretty big step backwards during the pandemic. And I think just a few things I'll make there about the opioid epidemic. On the left is the book by a Vermont physician, and we have met the enemy, and he is us. And I certainly think that I remember practicing in the 90s, and the kind of I guess I call it either the whiplash or the misunderstanding about too much pain relief, not enough pain relief. And so I don't think there's any question, at least in my mind, that I thought I had a part to play in that in terms of emergency departments, because truthfully, it was easier just to give them the medicines. And working late at night, that was oftentimes the easy way out. It was not the right thing to do. I think we've come a long way in understanding of that we certainly have a role. We played a role. In terms of the beginning of the epidemic, it could not have been totally Purdue and all the other drug companies and distributors. somebody had to write that prescription or give out that medicines. I think the middle panel is really talking about the, what I think most of us now believe, and I'm sure that the ACMT also agrees that one of the most effective strategies to reduce the opioid epidemic is to provide medically assisted treatment. And I'll tell you a story about our part of our response was that Medicaid was a friend of another colleague of mine. The legislation was run by, he ran Medicaid. He and I talked about it. We had caps on a methadone program. And I think we both agreed that there was no, why would you want a cap of medication that was potentially life-saving to individuals with substance use disorder? And then finally, on the right here is the thing that actually I've been just prior to the pandemic, I started to work on, was to ensure that in Vermont, that access to medical assisted treatment was available in emergency departments. We'd worked really hard to reduce the waiting list and to provide kind of treatment on demand, but we didn't necessarily have the way, the front door of the emergency department open to it. So now many, if not most, many emergency departments in Vermont are giving out MAT to individuals with a substance use disorder when they come in, even with overdoses. Obviously, a lot of being health commissioner is dealing with whatever the disaster might be. I think this one was probably a tropical storm Irene. Certainly, this is something which has probably gone on in spades with the coronavirus pandemic. Although, one of the things I loved about the job was this person-to-person connection and relationships. And as we all know, I'm sure all of this has been virtual and by Zoom. And so the world has changed. I guess I'd say I dodged a bullet here, as I have in many other instances. But I enjoyed it. Obviously, as an emergency physician, this disaster preparedness and response is something near and dear to my heart. Got to take a few helicopter rides with this is the commissioner of public safety during some of the disaster, either preparedness or some of the response. So now I want to briefly share with you a little bit about my own journey into public health. I was not trained in public health. I do not have a master's degree in public health, but I think I really gleaned and gained an appreciation during my time as commissioner. What is it? Strictly speaking, it's what we do collectively to ensure the condition in which people can be healthy. It's a science of protecting and improving health of people and their communities. So this is something I would show and discuss with people when I talked about public health. This is from a New England Journal article that kind of flipped a health on its head and so discussed, what are the causes of premature death. And they did their methodology really shows the kind of the pieces of the pie, the factors in influencing health. And obviously, I'm always drawn to the biggest one, which are the behavioral patterns. And so I really try to stress with people, and that's kind of the cornerstone of public health education, is that the thing that determines whether our longevity is really what we do. Our physical actions, whether it's we drink, whether we exercise, how we do with our diet, whether we put that seatbelt on when we get in the car, whether we talk on the cell phone, all of those things, ultimately one of the greatest predictors of health. And as you can see here, I was always a bit discouraged that healthcare itself is an important but relatively small piece of the pie. I think the great new frontier is genetics, and I think probably certainly in the next few decades, we're really going to start to understand a little more about how genetics influence our health status. I imagine a lot of that really relates to our susceptibilities in terms of our behavior patterns. social circumstances, and to the toxicologists, all of you toxicologists, environmental exposures certainly play a significant role in determining, are we healthy, will we have longevity or not? And the other side of the coin is, well, if that's what causes people to be healthy or unhealthy, how do we change that? How do we affect change in health? And I think this is the health impact pyramid by Tom Frieden, one of the previous directors of the CDC. He talked about, here are things that larger impact toward the bottom of the pyramid, makes sense. Smaller impact at the top. So, when you're counseling and education, very important. You tell people to be active. Obviously, it takes a lot of effort. It has a pretty small impact. We have clinical interventions like blood pressure medicines. You have long-lasting interventions like immunizations. And then you have changing the context, which I think from a policy perspective is very important. So fluoridation, iodization of salt, smoke-free laws, and tobacco tax, all those things really make those nudges important to how people make healthy choices. And then finally, what we'll call the social determinants of health at the bottom. If you don't have, if you don't have housing, you don't have food. Obviously, those are factors which have a very large impact on whether you're healthy or not. So for me, the next question was, well, what's next after I left the health department? And to be frank, I left the Governor Shumlin retired after 6 years as governor. The new governor, Governor Scott, who's done an outstanding job with coronavirus, came in. But I also knew that you have a pretty unique relationship with your governor if you're a health commissioner. And I knew that it would be a challenge and that it wouldn't probably go well in the end if I stayed on as health commissioner. So I volunteered to stay on for a few months in transition. I actually worked to find my successor. And then my wife and I fulfilled a lifelong dream of ours, which was to go overseas. We tried to do it early on in my career, but as I say, so often is the case, life gets in the way, whether life be kids, grandparents, jobs, and career. So we didn't get a chance to go early on in the career, but I got to spend 2017 and 18 in a program called Peace Corps Response in Uganda. And it was, I certainly highly recommend it to this group, and I'd encourage anybody to consider it. And so here we are in Uganda, and I got to experience the kind of the wonderful experience of spending a year in a totally foreign culture while trying to assist in providing skilled citizens for that country. Yeah, I'll talk a little bit more about it. Uganda is near the equator. The weather's pretty much the same all the time. And one of the nice things about it is we were down here in southwestern Uganda, not really close to the capital city of Kampala, but we were at about 8,000 feet, and so the weather was beautiful. Truly, it was every day was about the same. It was like 70 to 80 and 60 to 70 at night. So very comfortable in terms of the climate, and really allowed us to really live a pretty robust and satisfying life there. So this is the group. These are this is a program called what used to be called Global Health Service Partnerships. There's now called there's a new program that is less clinically oriented, mostly educationally oriented. And so in this group are pediatricians, there's an infectious disease doc, there's a nurse midwife, there's an OBGYN, critical care nurse practitioner, another midwife. So this is a group of individuals that go to, they're all English-speaking countries, because obviously you wouldn't have time to speak the language. And they go to teach, and they're going to fulfill one of the Peace Corps three goals, one being fulfilling the need for skilled individuals, training and increasing capacity in the country. So we were there to train nurses, to train doctors in Uganda. And then the other two goals relate to kind of bi-directional cultural exchange. So I'm fulfilling some of the third one here. But the second one is to really learn and understand the culture in the country that you're in, but also to share with people back home some of your experiences. And truly, it was an extraordinary experience. So Uganda is 44 million people. I wanted to highlight this. The median age was 17. So by comparison, the median age of Rwanda is 43. So it's an incredibly young population. The life expectancy is 63 versus 78 in the US. A pretty significant paucity of physicians, lots of traffic deaths, lots of deaths and disability preventable with emergency care, ambulances, but no system. Over half the hospitals have no emergency care, and the public health system was severely underfunded. And so my role for this year was to help start up the first emergency medicine residency in Uganda with a British physician who had done a lot of the legwork before. Lots of deaths from injuries, lots of road traffic accidents, as we call them. Obviously a fair share of suicide and homicides too. So, and comparatively more injury deaths than HIV, TB, and malaria. So this was during our orientation. We went to a health center 4, and this was their ER. And I got a little worried when I saw this. I said, oh, what have I got myself into? But the reality is this was a health center 4, it was not a hospital. And I would spend my time in a regional referral hospital, which was associated with an academic medical school. So this is the Embera Regional Referral Hospital, British colony, accidents and emergencies. And this is where we saw patients. This is one of those ambulances. They actually, many of them were donated. And I have to say, truthfully, I never saw a patient that came in these ambulances. You wondered, I think there are a lot of challenges from, there's no system. So you don't have anybody necessarily, will reliably answer the phone. You don't have anybody who reliably will provide the emergency care, much less the drivers or the gas that you need to actually, for the ambulance. So there are a lot of challenges. I think they're making progress. They have a commitment now to try to implement an emergency care system. Just a little bit of, this is Kampala, the largest city. And as you can see, it's a bit chaotic. There are a lot of these, oops, I'm sorry. There are a lot of bodabodas, which are these little motorcycles that one of the main ways of transport for individuals in terms of being cost efficient, but also able to navigate the traffic. The pedestrians do not have the right of way in Uganda, and certainly you saw the result of that in your emergency department. So here are the residents and the British physician and myself. These were 5 residents, I'll call them pioneers. And in Uganda, you go to medical school out of high school. It's 6 years. And then you spend a year in internship. And then after your internship, you go out and practice. So all of these physicians had been out in practice probably 5 years before they came back to residency. And then they come back to residency, and in Uganda, you had to pay for it. It's not paid for You don't get paid, but you have to actually pay for it. And so we'll call these the pioneers. They were a great bunch. They were really like a family and like brothers and sisters to one another. So it really was an astonishing way that they all related to one another. And as you can see, this is a pretty, spiffy looking resuscitation room here. As I said, the Ministry of Health in Uganda had made a commitment to emergency medicine, and we were the first program to get started. And they helped us equip a room with 2 beds, what we'll call the resuscitation room bay. The most of my job was teaching. I did do some clinical care. I would always do it with interns and residents, not by myself. It would be very hard. The students in blue are actually mid-level emergency care providers. So there was a sister program that we eventually worked from the same area that provided kind of mid-level emergency care, because not every hospital could have an emergency physician, especially when there weren't any. And this group of 5 were the first ones that trained in Uganda. The other person who helped a lot right behind me, you can see, was an Australian emergency physician. So between the British physician, the Australian physician, and myself, we were able to, during a week in around Christmas break, do ACLS, ATLS, and APLS. And I'm going to give you a little story about ATLS. Is, I'm not sure what they're using now in this country, but they were using dogs when I took ATLS. We used goats for this ATLS course, and we're able to actually have a dinner where we roasted the goat. Roasted goat is really one of the delightful things to eat in Uganda. We were able to use the goat in very many ways, and I certainly appreciate that. We got to train our residents. I think one of the major things you actually bring to them is just kind of this perspective on initial stabilization, perspective on what are the things you do first, the ABCs, all of those things. And so, these are our residents, but at the same time, I got to train the surgical residents and the medical residents. Again, trying to share with them that perspective of emergency care. As I said, the residents, this is the resident room, study room. This was an old kitchen. And as you can see, things are pretty sparse, but they all managed to study together, prepare together in terms of, and share with one another in terms of call, in terms of studying. This is a medical resident. We luckily did have an ultrasound, and we're able to do basic ultrasonography. I'm going to admit to you that I had to take a crash course before I went to Uganda. I got reasonably good, but not wonderful as I've seen with many of my, the people that followed me. We did teaching rounds. This is a gentleman with a transection of a spinal cord. You can see that we actually had this cardboard collar on him, and I'll share a little bit more about that in a bit. Sometimes there are no beds. Took care of patients on the floor. This is a trauma patient with doing a fast exam. We had a Ebola scare. We never did see Ebola, but the DRC was probably about 2.5, 3 hours away. So the public health system in Uganda is very robust. They probably graduate more public health clinicians, they do, than physicians. So they have a lot of people that are practitioners, and they have a pretty impressive system in terms of controlling outbreaks. Living in Uganda was not all easy. This is my wife, who's preparing. She worked at a hospice organization, not a clinician, but electricity was out. As you can see, she's working on a project, and I'm trying to do so by all the battery operated, the solar lights that we have. But at the same time, Uganda, there were many remarkable things in terms of wildlife and experiences. Whoops. And you went on safaris. You got to see incredible both scenery and wildlife. This is, we'd actually spent a day looking for lions. We happened to pull up in this one spot, and lo and behold, this lion just walked right out in front of us. So again, this is one of those times where serendipity or the wonderful things that happen unexpectedly come about. So as you can see here, these are the residents. They're doing their research project. We tried to work with them to do a research project. This is a cardboard cutout of a stiff neck collar, because there's no way in the world they could afford stiff neck collars. And so you basically created a pattern. You cut them out in cardboard, and this was a study to see how effective they were in immobilizing using a goniometer here. And what they found was it was very effective, not necessarily comfortable, but very effective. And they went on to present this at the African Federation of Emergency Medicine meeting shortly after I left. We also was able to secure a grant to get a simulation dummy. It had to be bulletproof, as things have to be there, and we're able to hold our own simulations. There's a pretty sophisticated simulation lab at the Embarrar University of Science and Technology, but it's always full, and so it was great for us to have our own dummy. At the end of my time, I was able to spend, we were able to take a little road trip, and I think there's one thing you can say about Africa is that if you've seen one African country, you've seen one African country. And I think that's, it became absolutely clear to me. So this is a trip we took to Tanzania, to Dar es Salaam, and to visit an emergency department at Muhimbili National Hospital. And it was an inspiration, I think, to me personally and to the residents, because somehow or another, and I think a lot of that came down to having a large grant. They were able to set up a emergency care system at this large hospital that was self-sustaining in terms of, and their staffing ratios would really put the staffing ratios that were present in Uganda really in perspective, because they had a lot of nurses, they had a lot of doctors. They actually charged the patients and were created a system that they were able to sustain their own infrastructure. And it was, I think, certainly an inspiration to our residents. So here it is. You saw the picture at the beginning. This is the end of our time. We're still smiling. Many of us have returned. I've returned at least a couple times to continue to teach. And actually it was last March, not last March, but March before that I actually the pandemic exploded. I almost got caught in Uganda when they closed down the airlines, but luckily I made it home. So this is a Peace Corps tradition where when you leave a country, you ring the gong, and when you ring the gong, you are changed from a Peace Corps volunteer to a returned Peace Corps volunteer. Again, extraordinary experience. I highly recommend it. I'm happy to talk to any of you about that, should you be more interested. And it certainly lives on in terms of these 5 pioneers are now emergency physicians in Uganda. The goal was to try to keep at least 3 of them at the university to teach the next generation of emergency physicians. And I'm working with them in terms of mentorship because I couldn't get back for the toxicology module. It's certainly hard to do given the time change remotely, but Paul and the ACMT has been gracious to allow them to access the content of the on-demand tox course. So I think that's certainly a helpful, very, very helpful thing that I'm grateful for. All right, so living in Uganda must be included in your CV, and it's a skill. So briefly, I want to just turn to poisoning. Here is kind of WHO data, and it's hard to say, but here's the dotted lines are the average mortality rate. Here's Africa, and over here are the Americas. So you can see that there's a significant factor of 4 to 5 increase of mortality for unintentional poisoning in the African region. You can see here on the bottom, you can see Uganda is kind of middle to high in terms of above the regional average of mortality per 100,000. So poisonings is definitely a problem. One of the causes, I think, should be no surprise. These are the regional poison centers throughout Africa, and there are a handful versus in the United States. So both in terms of the surveillance, or what they'll say in the British style toxicovigilance, but also the expertise in terms of how you manage much less prevention, which is probably fairly non-existent. So in terms of unintentional poisonings in Uganda, usually the accidental ones are the kids, and household chemicals, pesticides. Oftentimes the deaths come from the getting into grandpa's medicines. In terms of adults, the agrochemicals and household chemicals, carbon monoxide, and occasionally you'll get some methanol from brewing from home brews. The split seems to be rural tends to be occupational farmers. Urban tends to be more toward the intentional way. The suicide, the kind of intentional poisonings, interesting enough, there's a pretty significant male preponderance, especially in the successful ones. Many of them are pesticides. Females tend to use medications. And the urban, the rural ones tend to have more exposures to pesticides in terms of intentional poisonings, and a pretty young age group. So briefly, I'm going to just run through this. The residents have to do a research project, and this is one of the residents' research project on pesticides poisonings at the hospital. The pesticides are common. 30% of suicide deaths from deliberate ingestions of pesticides. Uganda is primarily agricultural country, and 45% deliberate self-poisonings, and 30% organophosphates among acute poisoning patients. Not a lot of epidemiologic data. There are no, really no tox labs. There was certainly, I never actually got a bicarb in the whole time I was there. So very limited laboratories, and you're going to have to rely on toxidromes. Very few ICU beds staffed, maybe one ventilator in a hospital if you're lucky, and really very little in terms of data to stratify patients. The objective of her study was to look at 1 in 4 hours and 1 week mortality, to analyze the correlation with triage and mortality, and to learn which of the poisonings led to most of the fatal poisonings. The results were, most of them were farmers, most of them were intentional. The triage was a mixture, and the time to presentation was pretty long, 7.5 hours. Mortality was less than, like 2% at 4 hours, and 20% at 1 week. There was no correlation between triage and mortality. There was association, no surprise, male sex, oxygen saturation, respiratory rate, blood pressure, and mortality. That was significant. The most fatal pesticides were the carbamates, mixed poisonings, and then, interesting enough, aluminum phosphide. So the conclusions of her study were patients with a PP have higher risk of dying within the first week than the first 4 hours. Males have a higher risk of dying. The results were conclusive in terms of triage, association. The saturation, respiratory rate, blood pressure was associated with mortality. And then kind of emerging new pesticides include aluminum phosphide and amitraz that are not in the traditional management books that are provided by the Ministry of Health. So now briefly, I want to just kind of touch on some of my other experiences in international medicine. This was in 2000, I believe, 10, after the earthquake in Haiti. I went there with the International Medical Corps, and I have to say this was a completely different experience. And so it's important to understand that this was the University Hospital in Port-au-Prince. They couldn't use the buildings, so you practice emergency medicine in a tent in the courtyard. The Haitian nurses and physicians were absent. Unfortunately, some of them had died in the nursing dorm when it collapsed. This was our resuscitation bay. These were the kind of volunteers with me from various residencies in the country. And I'd say it was a good experience for me to do it. It's not one that was particularly satisfying in terms of feeling like I made a difference on a larger scale. So be aware of that. This is to talk a little bit about the lessons there. This is an emergency medicine trauma conference in Uganda. Whoops. And you can see a fairly reasonable mix between people from the United States, in Britain and Canada, and local Ugandans. So I think that's what you want to see and ensure that the locals are driving what they need and you're assisting them rather than you creating the agenda. This is what happens to oftentimes equipment that's donated that you can't find spare parts for, you can't maintain them, you don't have the air conditioning necessary to keep a highly technical equipment going. And this was a quote that I thought was very telling, which was by Lila Watson, which is, if you've come here to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you've come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. And that really resonated with me after my experience at a year. So most recently, I'm going to finish up with what I've been doing before I left the CDC Foundation. I was helping advise our surge staff in Region 3, which is the greater DC region. I was also vaccinating back at home in Vermont. We were supporting states and territories during COVID with surge staff because public sector can oftentimes not hire quickly. We're able to hire as a foundation people quickly and place them in local health departments to build capacity in those departments. We also help community-based organizations because they were so instrumental into supporting especially communities of color that were disproportionately affected by the pandemic. I also chaired the COVID-19 Vaccine Implementation Advisory Committee in Vermont. And I'm happy to say that we have the highest vaccine rate in the nation. It's actually 84.6% of eligible Vermonters have started vaccination. But sadly, we are also seeing somewhat of a surge, much as the rest of the country. So we're not done yet. But we do know that vaccinations is really a very effective strategy, and I'm proud to say that Vermont has been largely successful at that. What's next? Well, hard to say. Certainly I'm looking for another adventure. As I hope that all of you are in your own lives, understanding that there are things you have to do, but opportunities that will present itself to you. So with that, I'm happy to either hear comments or questions, or but thank you for your time. Again, thank you all for your efforts to take care of patients during the pandemic.
Dr. Chen, thank you very much. I want to open it up to the group for questions. I have a question. Excuse me if there's a child in the background. We're working with what we can here, listening to that, I was amazed at your ability to pivot. And this is something I've been told by some senior advisors, that you shouldn't be afraid in your career to pivot from the trajectory you're currently on to an opportunity that comes up. But to me, that sounds terrifying. I mean, there's uncertainty when you take something on so different than the traditional path. And I guess that really struck when you were talking about the first time you pivoted away from your long emergency department career into a political career. And I just wonder if you can comment on how you ultimately made that decision.
Well, I think it's, I mean, some of it is, understanding this concept of serendipity, something good comes unexpected. I mean, that's really what it is. I think that the key for me, I mean, how is that any different than what you do in the emergency department, right? Right? Every patient's different. And so you don't know what's going to walk in that door or what's going to come through the ambulance bay. So I think a lot of it is our ability to be flexible, our ability to focus and work hard. So one of the things that I always believe in it, and I tell people this all the time, that life is not linear. And we'd all love, maybe it would be easier to think about it being linear, but the zigs and the zags are some of the most wonderful things that you'll see in your life. And so don't be afraid to do that. I mean, sometimes it's going to flop. I mean, truthfully, I mean, but build yourself enough of a support system, of a community that will support you in case that happens. But ultimately, when you do decide to do that pivot, go with the gusto. I mean, I think, so one of my things I always told my assistant when I was at the health department is, I'd say, just say yes. Somebody wants you to do something, just say yes. And, you just do it all. You jump in, you dive in, and people appreciate that, definitely.
Thank you. Does anybody else have any questions or comments? Feel free to raise your hand and I can unmute you.
Hey, Paul.
Hi, well, I'd just like to thank you for really a wonderful presentation. And it was really a fascinating look back at a fascinating career. And to the question that was just asked about the pivoting, as someone who's pivoted quite a bit myself, I think particularly for some of our junior colleagues and whatnot, it's great to see the opportunities that do present oneself. And emergency medicine is a wonderful career, but has all sorts of challenges. And one, it does not necessarily need to be, pigeonholed into doing the same thing, throughout their career. As we know, there was a recent report released that there's going to be an oversupply of emergency physicians in the next few years, which is, somewhat concerning, particularly to folks that are just training now. And that there are these opportunities, and I think it's kind of fascinating. And the public health, as a toxicologist, we are centered in a capacity to do a lot of good work in public health, and what you did is really very inspiring. And again, I'd like to thank you for sharing with us today your story.
Sure. And thank you, Paul, for inviting me.
Yes.
And I'm going to just throw out there an invitation. If somebody wants to talk more about some of these things, throw some ideas out to me. Paul or Nick certainly has my email, and I'm happy to entertain questions.
Okay, and I think just to make one further comment, I think there's a number of our colleagues and ACMT members that are quite interested in international health and toxicology overseas, in working in countries that don't have the same resources. And I think you provided us with a a nice window of what you did in Uganda, and maybe we'll get back to you about some challenges that we're confronting to try to get further rooted in some of these areas of the world where we may be able to provide some assistance. I think those quotes that you provided at the end are very important in terms of what is the role for the outsider. But I think so many of us want to share our knowledge base with others and find out how to make these opportunities work. They don't often come out of thin air, so you have to invest in developing that path. But it's certainly possible, as you've shown us today.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Good.
That was excellent. It's the top of the hour. Does anybody else have any other comments? All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you again, Dr. Chen. That was excellent.